Hello, I'm Karen Stathoplos, and today I'm going to be reading an excerpt from the first chapter of Fauna and Family by Gerald Durrell. I want to say Durrell, but it's Durrell. He's written several wonderful books about his family's adventures when they lived on the island of Corfu. He was 12 at the time, and he had brothers and sisters, and there is an equally wonderful masterpiece theater, if you're interested in hearing more about this, called The Durrells in Corfu, that whenever it's on, I must watch. It's deeply hilarious, and his family is just so rewarding. So here we are, the Garden of the Gods. The island lay bent like a misshapen bow, its two tips nearly touching the Greek and Albanian coastlines, and the blue waters of the Ionian Sea were caught in its curve like a blue lake. In fine weather, we always had our meals on the veranda at the rickety marble-topped table, and it was here that all major family decisions were taken. It was at breakfast time that there was liable to be the most acrimony and dissension, for it was then that letters, if any, were read in plans for the day, were made, remade, and discarded. It was during these early morning sessions that the family fortunes were organized, albeit haphazardly, so that a simple request for an omelet might end in a 3-month camping expedition to a remote beach, as actually happened on one occasion. So, when we were assembled in the brittle morning light, one was never quite sure how the day was going to get on its feet. To begin with, one had to step warily, for tempers were fragile, but gradually, under the influence of tea, coffee, toast, homemade marmalade, eggs, and bowls of fruit, a lessening of the early morning tension would be felt, and a more benign atmosphere would begin to permeate the veranda. The morning that heralded the arrival of the Count among us was no different than any other. We had all reached the final cup of coffee stage, and each was busy with his own thoughts. Margot, my sister, her blonde hair done up in a bandana, was musing over pattern books, humming gaily but tunelessly to herself. Leslie had finished his coffee and produced a small automatic pistol from his pocket, dismantled it, and was absent-mindedly cleaning it with his handkerchief. My mother was perusing the pages of a cookery book in pursuit of a recipe for lunch, occasionally breaking off to stare into space as she tried to remember if she had all the necessary ingredients for the recipe she was thinking of making. Larry, my elder brother, clad in a multicolored dressing gown, was eating cherries with one hand and reading his mail with the other. I was occupied feeding my latest acquisition, a young jackdaw, a singularly slow eater. While waiting for him to digest each mouthful, I stared down the hill at the beckoning sea and planned my day. Should I make a trip to the high olive groves in the center of the island, try to catch the agamas that lived on the glittering gypsum cliffs where they basked in the sun, tantalizing me by wagging their yellow heads and puffing out their orange throats? Or should I go down to the small lake in the valley behind the villa, where the dragonfly larvae should be hatching? Or, happiest thought of all, should I take my new boat, the Boodle Bum Tricket, on a major sea trip? In spring, the almost enclosed sheet of water that separated Corfu from the mainland would be a pale and delicate blue. To me, this blue kingdom was a treasure house of strange beasts which I longed to collect and observe. I decided on the sea trip. Larry, meanwhile, said casually to Mother, "Marco's sending Count Rossignol for a couple of days." "Who's he?" asked Mother. "I don't know," said Larry. Mother straightened her glasses and looked at him. "What do you mean you don't know?" she asked. "What I say," said Larry. "I don't know. I've never met him." "Well, who's Marco?" "I don't know. I've never met him either. He's a good artist, though." "Larry, dear, you can't start inviting people you don't know to stay," said Mother. "It's bad enough entertaining the ones you do know without starting on the ones you don't know." "What's knowing them got to do with it?" asked Larry, puzzled. "Well, if you know them, at least they know what to expect," Mother pointed out. "It's just that this house so seldom seems normal. I do try, but we don't seem to be able to live like other people somehow." Well, if they come to stay here, they must put up with us, said Larry. And anyway, you can't blame me. I didn't invite him. Marco's sending him. But that's what I mean, said Mother. Complete strangers sending complete strangers to us, as if we were a hotel or something. Trouble with you is you're antisocial, said Larry. And so would you be if you had to do the cooking, said Mother indignantly. Really, Larry, you do make me cross sometimes. I'm going down to see Leonora's baby, said Margot. Is there anything you want from the village? Oh, yes, said Larry. That reminds me, Leonora's asked me to be a godparent to the brat. Leonora was our maid Lugarezia's daughter, who used to come up to the house and help us when we had a party, and who, because of her sparkling good looks, was a favorite of Larry's. You, a godfather? Asked Margot in astonishment. I thought godfathers were supposed to be pure and religious and things. How nice of her, said Mother doubtfully, but it's a bit odd, isn't it? Not half so odd as it would be if she asked him to be father, said Leslie. Leslie, dear, don't say things like that in front of Jerry, even in fun. Are you going to accept, Larry? Yes, said Larry. Why shouldn't the poor little thing have the benefit of my guidance? Ha! Said Margot derisively. Well, I shall tell Leonora that if she thinks you're going to be pure and religious, she's trying to make a pig's poke out of a sow's ear. If you can translate that into Greek, you're welcome to tell her, said Larry. My Greek's just as good as yours, said Margot belligerently. Now, dears, don't quarrel, said Mother. I do wish you wouldn't clean your guns with your handkerchief, Leslie. The oil is impossible to get out. Well, I've got to clean them with something, said Leslie aggrievedly. At this point, I told Mother I was going to spend the day exploring the coast, and could I have a picnic? Yes, dear, she said absently. Tell Lugarezia to organize something for you. But do be careful, dear, and don't go into very deep water. Don't catch a chill and watch out for sharks. To Mother, every sea, no matter how shallow or benign, was an evil and tumultuous body of water, full of tidal waves, waterspouts, typhoons, whirlpools, inhabited entirely by giant octopus and saber-toothed sharks, all of whom had the killing and eating of one or other of her progeny as their main objective in life. Assuring her that I would take great care, I hurried off to the kitchen and collected the food for myself and my animals, assembled my collecting equipment, whistled the dogs, and set off down the hill to the jetty where my boat was moored. The Boodle Bum Tricket, being Leslie's first effort in boat building, was almost circular and flat-bottomed, so that with her attractive color scheme of orange and white stripes, she looked not unlike an ornate celluloid duck. She was a friendly, stalwart craft, but owing to her shape and her lack of keel, she became very flustered in anything like a heavy sea and would threaten to turn upside down, a thing she was very prone to do in moments of stress. So when I went on any long expeditions in her, I always took plenty of food and water in case we were blown off course and shipwrecked. Roger was a fine dog to take to sea, and he thoroughly enjoyed it. Whittle and Puke, on the other hand, were not sea dogs and were really most at home tracking down some not too fierce quarry in the myrtle bushes. When they came to sea, they tried to be helpful, but rarely succeeded, and in a crisis would start howling or jumping overboard, or, if thirsty, drinking seawater and then vomiting over your feet just as you were about to do some tricky bit of navigation. Ulysses, my scops owl, I could never tell if he really liked sea trips. He would sit dutifully wherever I placed him, his eyes half closed, looking like one of the more malevolent carvings of oriental deities. My pigeon Quilp adored boating. He would take over the Boodle Bum Trinket's minute foredeck and carry on as though it were the promenade deck of the Queen Mary. He would pace up and down, pausing to do a quick waltz occasionally, and with pouting chest would give a quick contralto concert, looking strangely like a large opera singer on a sea trip. On this particular day, I had decided to pay a visit to a small bay, one side of which was formed by a tiny island surrounded by reefs, and in which there dwelt a host of fascinating creatures. My particular quarry was a peacock blenny, which I knew lived in profusion in that shallow water. Blennies are curious-looking fish with elongated bodies, some 4 inches long, shaped rather like an eel, and with their pop eyes and thick lips, they are vaguely reminiscent of a hippopotamus. There follows a wonderful description of his search of the 2 blennies, which he wanted to capture so he could observe the courtship in his aquarium. But meanwhile, 3 days later, the Count appeared. He was tall and slender, with tightly curled hair, as golden as a silkworm's cocoon, shining with oil, a delicately curled mustache of a similar hue, and slightly protuberant eyes of a very pale and unpleasant green. He alarmed Mother by arriving with a huge wardrobe trunk, and she was convinced he had come to stay for the summer. But we soon found that the Count found himself so attractive that he found it necessary to change his clothes about 8 times a day to do justice to himself. His English was limited, but this did not prevent him from expounding on any subject with a sort of sneering dogmatism that made everyone's hackles rise. His philosophy, if any, could be summed up in the phrase, "We do it better in France," which he used repeatedly about everything. He arrived, unfortunately, in time for lunch, and by the end of the meal, without really trying, he had succeeded in alienating everybody, including the dogs. It was in its way quite a tour de force to be able to irritate and insult 5 people of such different character with such ease, and apparently without even being aware of doing it, inside 2 hours of arrival at a new locale. During the course of lunch, he said, having just eaten a soufflé as delicate as a cloud in which were embedded the pale pink bodies of freshly caught shrimps, that it was quite obvious that Mother's chef was not French. Having discovered that Mother was the chef, he showed no embarrassment, but merely said that she would then be glad of his presence, for it would enable him to give her some guidance in the culinary arts. Leaving her speechless with rage at his audacity, he turned his attention to Larry, to whom he vouchsafed the information that the only good writers are French. To Leslie, he offered the information that anyone who was interested in hunting must assuredly have the instincts of a criminal, and in any case it was well known that the French produced the best guns, swords, and other weapons of offense. To Margot, he gave the advice that it was a woman's job to keep beautiful for men, and in particular not to be greedy and eat too many things that would ruin the figure. As Margot was suffering from a certain amount of puppy fat at that time and was on a rigid diet in consequence, this information was not at all well received. He merely condemned himself in my eyes by calling the dogs village curs and comparing them unfavorably to his selection of Labradors, Setters, Retrievers, and Spaniels, all French bred, of course. Small wonder, then, that after lunch, when he went upstairs to change, the family were quivering like a suppressed volcano, and only Mother's golden rule that a guest must not be insulted on the first day kept us in check. "You see," said Mother accusingly to Larry, "this is what comes of letting people you don't know send people you don't know to stay. The man's insufferable." "Well, he's not so bad," said Larry feebly, trying to argue against an attitude with which he agreed. "I thought some of his comments were valid." "What?" said Mother ominously. "Yes, what?" said Margot, quivering. "Well," said Larry vaguely, "I thought that soufflé was a bit on the rich side, and Margot is beginning to look a bit circular." "Beast!" said Margot and burst into tears. "No, that's quite enough," Larry said. "Mother, how we're going to endure this scented lounge lizard of yours for another week, I don't know." "Well, I've got to put up with him too, don't forget," said Larry, irritated. "Well, he's your friend. Your friend's friend. Well, whatever he is, he's yours," said Mother. "And it's up to you to keep him out of the way as much as possible." "Or I'll pepper his arse for him," said Leslie, "the smelly little—" "Leslie," said Mother, "that's quite enough." "Well, he is," said Leslie doggedly. "I know he is, dear, but you shouldn't say so." "Well, I'll try," said Larry, "but don't blame me if he comes down to the kitchen to give you a cookery lesson." "I'm warning you," said Mother mutinously. "If that man sets foot in my kitchen, I will go and stay in a hotel until he's gone," said Mother, uttering her favorite threat. "And this time I really mean it." To give Larry his due, he did strive manfully with Count Rossignol for the next days. The Count compared the library unfavorably with the Bibliothèque Nationale, said that the museum was not a patch on the Louvre, said the Kaiser's palace was inferior in size, design, and furnishings to the cottage he had for his head gardener, and that the view from Pantocrator was not to be mentioned in the same breath with any view seen from any high spot in France. "The man's intolerable," said Larry, refreshing himself with brandy in Mother's bedroom, where we had all repaired to escape the Count's company. "He's got an obsession with France, and I can't think why he ever left the place." "Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could do something really nasty to him?" said Margot wistfully. "Something really horrible?" "No, Margot," said Mother firmly. "We've never done anything nasty to anyone that stayed with us. Except as a joke or by accident. And we're not going to start. We'll just have to put up with him after all. It's only for a few more days. It'll soon pass." "Dear God," said Larry suddenly, "I've just remembered. It's the bloody christening on Monday." "I do wish you wouldn't swear so much," said Mother. "What's that got to do with it?" "Can you imagine taking him to a christening?" "No, he'll just have to go off somewhere on his own." "I don't think we ought to let him go wandering off on his own," said Mother, as if she were talking about a dangerous animal. He might meet one of our friends." We all sat and thought about the problem. "Why doesn't Jerry take him somewhere?" said Leslie suddenly. "After all, he doesn't want to come to a boring christening." Immediately, all my instincts for self-preservation came to the fore. I said I did want to go to the christening. I had been looking forward to it. "I know. Take him out in your boat," suggested Margot brightly. "Excellent," said Larry. "I'm sure he's got a straw hat and a striped blazer among his sartorial effects. Perhaps we can borrow a banjo." "It's a very good idea," said Mother. "After all, it's only for a couple of hours. You surely wouldn't mind that." I stated in no uncertain terms that I would mind it very much indeed, but I could see that I was going to have the Count for the afternoon. The Count outfitted himself for the expedition in pale blue linen trousers, elegant chestnut bright shoes, a white silk shirt with a blue and gold cravat knotted carelessly at the throat, and an elegant yachting cap. While the boodle bum trinket was ideal for my purposes, I would have been the first to admit that she had none of the refinements of an ocean-going yacht, and this the Count was quick to perceive when I led him down to the canal in the maze of old Venetian salt pans below the house, where I had the boat moored. "This is yacht?" he asked in surprise and some alarm. I said that indeed this was our craft, and stalwart and stable, and he would note a flat bottom to make it easier to walk about in. Whether he understood me or not, I do not know, but he climbed in delicately, spread his handkerchief fastidiously over the seat, and sat down gingerly. I congratulated myself on the fact that only the day before I had decided that the boodle bum trinket was starting to smell, and I had sunk her in some 2 feet of seawater and given her bilges a thorough cleaning. So now, for this expedition, she was sparkling clean and smelt beautifully of sun-hot tar and salt water. "I smell," the Count pointed out. "In France, the water is hygiene." I told him that this problem would be overcome once we reached the open lake, when, to my alarm, I noticed something wrong with the Boodle Bum trinket. She had settled sluggishly in the brown water and was hardly moving. For a moment, I could not imagine what was wrong with her. We had not run aground. Then suddenly, I noticed this swirl of water coiling up over the boards in the bottom of the boat. Surely, I thought, she could not have sprung a leak. Fascinated, I watched the water rise to engulf the bottom of the oblivious Count's shoes, and I suddenly realized what must have happened. When I had cleaned out the bilges, I had, of course, removed the bung in the bum trinket's bottom to let the fresh seawater in. Apparently, I had not replaced it with enough care, and now the canal water was pouring into the bilges. The Count was still oblivious. So inch by inch, I eased my boat toward the shore. We were within 10 feet of the bank when the Count noticed what was happening. "Mon Dieu!" he cried shrilly. "We are submerged! My shoe is submerged! The boat you have sunk!" I stopped pulling to soothe the Count. I told him there was no danger, and all he had to do was sit still until I got him to the bank. I should have him on dry land in a moment. And indeed, if he had done what I said, this would have been the case, for I was within 6 feet of the shore. But the Count was worried about the state of his shoes, and this prompted him to do something very silly. He saw land looming close, and in spite of my warning shout, he got to his feet and leapt onto the Boodle Bum trinket's minute foredeck. His intention was to leap from there to safety, but he had not reckoned with the Boodle Bum trinket's temperament. A placid boat, she had a few quirks, and one thing she did not like was anyone standing on her foredeck. She simply gave an odd bucking sort of twist, like a trained horse in a cowboy film, and as it were, slid you over her shoulder. She did this to the Count now. He fell into the water with a yell, spread-eagled like an ungainly frog. I was filled with a mixture of alarm and delight. I was delighted the Count had fallen in, though I knew my family would never believe that I had not engineered it, but I was alarmed at the way he was thrashing about. It was not good to thrash into the mud of the canal. He tried to get up once, but at the terrible gobbling clutch of the mud, he uttered a despairing cry like a bereaved seagull and lay still. I tried to overcome my laughter at the entire predicament. "Why you laughing? Why you laughing?" screamed the Count, trying to look over his shoulder at me. Eventually, I started to pull the Count again and eventually got him fairly close to shore. And then, after I formed some rope with fronds, the Count was able to pull himself along this until he reached dry land. When he eventually got somewhat shakily to his feet, he looked as though the lower half of his body had been encased in melting chocolate. He was not happy. It was unfortunate, perhaps, that the Count and I should have arrived at the front door of the villa just as the huge Dodge, driven by our scowling, barrel-shaped, self-appointed guardian angel, Spiro Halikiopoulos, drew up with a family, flushed with wine, in the back of it. The car came to a halt, and the family stared at the Count with disbelieving eyes. It was Spiro who recovered first. "Golly, Mrs. Durrells," he said, twisting his massive head round and beaming at Mother. "Master Jerry's fixes the bastards." This was obviously the sentiment of the whole family, but Mother threw herself into the breach. "My goodness, Count, what have you been doing with my son?" The Count was so overcome by the audacity of this remark that he could only look at Mother open-mouthed. "Jerry, dear, go and change out of those wet things before you catch cold. There's a good boy." "Good boy!" repeated the Count shrilly and unbelievingly. "C'est un assassin!" Now, my dear fellow," said Larry, throwing his arm around the Count's muddy shoulders. "I'm sure it's all been a mistake. Come and have a brandy and change your things." Larry led the vociferous Count into the house, and the rest of the family converged on me. "What did you do to him?" asked Mother. I said I had not done anything. The Count, and the Count alone, was responsible for his condition. "I don't believe you," said Mother. "You always say that." I protested that had I been responsible, I would be proud to confess. The family were impressed by the logic of this.